Before this video begins, I want to thank ExpressVPN for partnering up with me to provide affiliate links to their VPN. For those who are unaware, a VPN is a service that allows you to encrypt your normally public data from potential threats looking to build an online profile of you and sell that info to anyone willing to buy it. And boy, I don't think I need to tell you how real stuff like identity theft is. Hell, my own family had a run-in with this very problem thanks to our information being public, and it was one hell of a headache to resolve. With VPNs though, that is a worry of the past, since now all my data is hidden from websites, my ISP, and even the company I brought the VPN from. And you know what else? ExpressVPN also comes with an added bonus, as it allows you to bypass a website's geoblock, allowing you to access the full library of Netflix shows, Amazon Prime content, Hulu exclusives, and similar stuff from other sites without having to live in the US. Now, I've used a handful of VPNs in my day, but Express is easily my favorite thanks to their ease of use. Simply select the country you want your signal to be bounced from, and bam! I just went from the USA to Canada in the span of 10 seconds and no one was the wiser. In addition, ExpressVPN also has a really cool feature that allows you to sign up to 5 devices with one payment, and surprisingly, despite all of my immediate family using the same service, we'd never experienced any kind of drops in internet speed, even when I play games online, which is usually a prime location for drops in quality. But let's say something goes awry with the service. Well, Express also has a 24/7 customer support live chat going, with response times averaging in seconds. But if you still end up not liking Express, you can always ask for your money back, so long as it's within a 30-day window. If any of this got you interested in ExpressVPN, you can sign up through my affiliate link in the description. Once again, thank you to ExpressVPN for this opportunity, and now, on with the video. It's that time of the year again, Halloween. The time where it's socially acceptable to dress like a devil and scare the daylights out of your fellow men for kicks, forming a holiday which many have enjoyed for generations. Many, except for me. While I enjoy the concept of Halloween, it's my anxious disposition that prevents me from enjoying anything that has to do with the event. Basically, if I know that something scary is going to happen, I'll be on constant edge waiting for it to happen. The time I'm waiting on edge being increased by the activity I'm doing, so in the case of a horror movie, it'd be roughly an hour and a half, and in the case of Halloween, it would be an entire day. Because of this, I naturally became repelled by anything horror related, as a result becoming a much bigger fan of the more loud and in-your-face action genre, which has remained this way for as long as I could remember. Thing is though, even though I do my damnedest not to interact with horror, the genre itself seems to follow me around like a stray dog looking to be pet, as the world itself is crazy for this holiday, throwing my fears back in my face year after year. And so finally I decided if you can't beat them, I should probably try and conquer my fears. However, I'm not one to pet a stray without a glove, and if I'm gonna conquer my fears, I can't make this a straight torture session with no fun. So I'm gonna be tackling a game that gives me what I like and what I'm afraid of, which brings me to the game in question. Resident Evil is a series that needs no introduction, being that faces the horror genre in the world of gaming since its inception back in '96, and being one of Capcom's biggest cash cows in the 24 years the series has been active. Throughout the years, the series managed to make waves through the gaming landscape, to the point where people like myself has heard about it, despite having no interest in Resident Evil prior to this video. One of the most well-known examples of this is Resident Evil 4, being labeled as a masterpiece when it released back in '04, and being praised as such to this day, 16 years after the fact. However, while loved by many, Resident Evil 4 is somewhat controversial among the series' more dedicated fans, as they say it's too action-heavy and started a trend which caused the later games to become more action-focused as well. While I empathize with the more dedicated fans of Resident Evil, personally speaking from the outside looking in, this is as up my alley as a horror-based game series could be. Now, I imagine there will be some problems diving in this deep into the series, the most notable of all being lore, which I'm not too familiar with. I mean, I know a few things. I know that this guy's name is Chris, and this guy's Wesker, who's the bad guy of the first game, and that Chris defeats Wesker by calling on his best friend, Phoenix Wright, who upon gathering the necessary evidence pieces was able to send Wesker to jail, ending the game. It should be stated, all the lore I know about Resident Evil comes from Marvel vs. Capcom, so there may be some discrepancies in there, but I digress. I'm interested to see how I mesh with this game, if I mesh with it at all, so let's stop beating around the bush and dive right into Resident Evil 4. The game opens up on a brief bit of exposition, where the narrator recounts events of the last few games, talking about how a place called Raccoon City became the breeding ground for zombies, forcing the president to nuke it to Kingdom Come. While the city was lost, the narrator continues on by saying that the company behind all this, known as Umbrella, got cooked as well. Not in the explosion, but in their plummeting stock, as when the news broke out that they were behind it, no one wanted to deal with them anymore. As we cut away from stock footage, we see our main character and the narrator of the earlier exposition scene, Leon S. Kennedy, a survivor of the Raccoon City outbreak who has now become a special agent for the United States, ironically finding himself in Europe hitching a ride with the local cops. Why is he in Europe? Well, it's got something to do with the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, as she's gone missing recently, with a little village in Europe being her last known location. Unfortunately, they can only get so far by car, with the village from here on out only being accessible on foot, leading Leon to continue on alone, finding a house not too far away from the car. When he enters the building and decides to ask the owner some questions, the man takes out an axe and attempts to attack Leon, causing him to shoot him in defense. But it doesn't end there, as the sound of gunfire attracts the attention of his neighbors, forcing Leon to plow his way through them as well, eventually arriving at the village where everything seems peaceful, if you ignore the burning corpse smack dab in the middle of the place. As expected, once the villagers see Leon, they all gun for him, one of them being so dead set on killing him he even wields a friggin' chainsaw. But strangely enough, when they all have Leon's back against the wall, they suddenly get their attention pulled away from him thanks to a church bell ringing in the distance, which the villagers all feel compelled to follow for some reason. Leon then begins quipping at no one, and after realizing he's alone, he continues on a search for Ash, when he comes across a man tied up in a closet named Luis. The two don't get much of a chance to know each other as the villagers come back with a gigantic man at least a foot taller than Leon. Leon, despite being armed with a shotgun, decides that the best course of action to getting out of the situation is to kick the behemoth, which gets him knocked out for his troubles. While unconscious, not only did the villagers steal his coat, but they injected Leon with some kind of egg. At first, it doesn't do anything to him, which makes his and Luis's escape run smoothly. But shortly after splitting up from Luis and dealing with the monster at the bottom of the lake, Leon begins coughing up blood and then passes out for 6 hours and has a vision of something inside his blood taking over his body. When Leon awakes, he decides to ignore it and continue on his search for Ash, finding her shortly after in the church that saved him earlier from the villagers. Ash seems no worse for wear outside of this cowboy thing that Capcom was doing for some reason with the 4th iteration of their games, but on the way out, they run into the mastermind behind Ash's kidnapping, a cult leader by the name of Sadler. And like any mastermind, he rattles off the entirety of his plan to the both of them, explaining that he wants them to go back to America so that the egg placed inside her, known as a Plagas, can fully mature, giving Sadler complete control over her mind, allowing him to influence the president. I'd like to point out that neither of them knew Sadler had any of this plan and that he'd win if he literally said nothing, but whatever, I guess he assumed that they found out more than they actually knew. Sadler then tries to recapture Ash, which forces them outside the church and takes them all over Europe as they try to remove the egg from themselves, all the while escaping Sadler's clutches. The rest of the game is dedicated to following their escape, and I gotta say, for a numbered Resident Evil title, this is incredibly easy to follow, save for one specific cutscene. There are only 2, technically 3 characters who have appeared in past Resident Evil games, and when they encounter one another, the only thing that's important to note is that they already know each other by name. According to Hiroyuki Kobayashi, the producer of Resident Evil 4, in a Biohaze interview, he stated, "I've worked on a number of Resident Evil titles in the past, and honestly, I think the series has been recycling the same patterns, the same gameplay style each time. The creator started to get bored of it, so I talked to Mikami-san, the director, and we talked about reshaping the series and winning back the fans, as well as winning over the new fans who never thought they'd play a Resident Evil game. This doesn't specify anything about the story, but the want to win over new fans probably had something to do with it. Side note, apparently this idea to revitalize the series was at first supposed to be in the form of injecting new blood into development by having Twitter's very own royal guard Hideki Kamiya direct the game, but he instead created a game that's too fantastical for Resident Evil standards, which became its own thing called DMC. This fact is actually a pretty big reason on why I decided to look at Resident Evil 4, as Dante is one of my favorite video game characters of all time, so I kinda wanted to see what they ended up replacing his game with. And to be honest, this game isn't much more grounded, but I digress. Graphically, for a game that was released in '04 and upscaled to HD, it doesn't look half bad. I mean, the floor textures can at times look like a garbled mess, but when it comes to the character models, I think they hold up a decent bit, so long as you don't look at their ears, which look like they're made out of paper mache. An interesting oddity I found when playing Resident Evil 4 on my monitor is that there's some kind of fuzz on the screen at all times. I don't know why this is a thing, and I've literally never seen it in any other video game before in my life, but at the very least I can say it didn't impede my gameplay at all. It was just an interesting graphical hiccup that I thought I'd bring mention to. Moving on from the graphics, another way that you can tell that this game was made in '04 was the large amount of QuickTime events it has in it. I never found them to be particularly bothersome, but it should be noted that if you're watching a cutscene, don't put down the controller, as one could show up when you least expect it and instantly kill you. Thankfully, the checkpoint system seems to be rather generous, putting you right before it happens so you aren't too far a ways back, but just know that it can happen. For all this talk about action, I did find that Resident Evil 4 scared me quite a bit, some may even say paralyzed me. But in order to discuss that, I first need to talk about the gameplay, as it's where I found myself the most frightened. The most interesting thing about Resident Evil 4's controls is how movement is handled, operating on something known as tank controls, which was apparently a super popular control scheme when survival horror was in its prime. In layman's terms, there are only two directions Leon can move in at any point, being forward by tilting up on the analog stick, and backwards by tilting him back. If you want Leon to turn, you have to tilt the analog stick in the corresponding direction you want him to turn. However, holding that direction won't make him walk, it will only turn him. If you want Leon to walk in the direction you just turned him in, you have to press forward. It doesn't sound that complicated, and truth be told it isn't. I just found it a little odd that up was the only way to move forward, as odd as that sentence sounds, but once again it's a pretty simple concept to get a hold of, taking me about 5 minutes max to get used to. Tank controls aside, the rest of the game controls more or less how you'd expect a shooter to control, with L2 readying your gun, L1 readying your knife, and R2 being used to attack with the readied weapon. While most of the offense is dedicated to the shoulder buttons, the face buttons aren't left out in the cold, as 3 out of 4 of them have a use, however, said use is non-combative, with the X button being used to run while holding the analog stick forward, or turn around while holding it back. The triangle button brings up the map, and the square button is a little unique, as it's a context-sensitive button doing anything from opening doors to suplexing enemies. While not as versatile as, say, Yakuza's context-sensitive button, as Resident Evil 4's only has 3 attacks, and they're all dependent on the enemy you face, I still got a lot of fun out of it, especially when one of the more over-the-top animations played out. Specifically the one where Leon jumps out of a window, which is super extra for no reason. And finally, the last button I've yet to talk about is the R1 button, which when pressed tells Ash to either follow Leon or wait behind. That last one isn't introduced to you until you rescue Ash from the church, which I honestly thought was going to bring the pace of the game down, as I'd have to constantly look over my shoulder to make sure that she was alright. And while you definitely have to pay attention to her, because if she dies or gets kidnapped, it's a game over, you don't have to pay that close attention to her because you have a gun and they don't, so as long as you space yourself out from them, you'll be fine. The game also provides certain points where you can leave Ashley in trash bins where she belongs and take out the surrounding enemies in peace without fear of anything happening to her. Now, even though I just said enemies don't have guns, that doesn't mean they won't try and use her regular farm tools like one, leading to unexpected situations where Ash gets tagged. She won't die from it, but she won't be in any kind of position to take another hit. To get her out of the state, all you need to do is give her a few healing items, with which the game provides you with quite a few options. The primary method of healing is through herbs, which depending on the color of herb has a different effect that it can impart on your health bar. The only herb that will outright heal you is the green herb, however it does so for an extremely small amount. If you want to get anything more out of healing, then you need to combine the green herb with another green herb, which will heal you for the equivalent of, well, 2 green herbs, or the other 2 colored herbs, which when combined, the red herb gives you a full heal, and the yellow herb expands your health bar, but still heals you for the exact same amount as a regular green herb. You can combine all 3 to get their effects simultaneously, just know that you have to find them all first, and when you're doing so, situations may arise that force you to take an herb you thought of saving. In addition to herbs, the game also has eggs and first aid spray, the former coming from snakes which randomly appear in crates and boxes, while the latter can be found hidden in chests or purchased from the merchant. Who is the merchant? I have no idea, and the game doesn't even try to explain him. But he's here to help despite at some points looking like he has red eyes like the villagers, and he brings in some damn good help, as not only does he supply you with an arsenal of weapons to take on Sadler, but sometimes when a boss is coming up, he'll even provide you with some ammo and healing items so you aren't caught with your pants at your ankles. Now, you can give all your super good healing items to Ash, but I think at least in terms of mixed herbs, they're better suited for Leon. In my playthrough of Resident Evil 4, I game overed more often because I got too reckless with Leon than I ever did because Ash got hit with a stray axe. This is mostly because she isn't attached to my side at all times, as there are quite a number of instances throughout the game where Leon is separated from Ash and is forced to find his way to her before Sadler's goons. When you reunite with her, the game will give her a full heal from her previous condition, so you don't have to waste any healing items on her. As such, Leon is a constant variable you need to take into account as he's with you at all times, warranting the more immediate use of a mixed herb. In fact, I beat the entire game without ever upgrading Ash's health despite the game giving you more than enough herbs to do so. It was just never necessary, since the enemies normally targeted Leon for their attacks. It should also be noted that herbs aren't the only thing that can be combined, as there are certain key items and treasures that can also be combined to either move on with the game or get a bigger payout when you sell it to the merchant. The price of a treasure with different items inserted into it being much greater than the treasures sold separately. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the merchant also gives you ammo at certain points. Ammo of course being an essential part of offense that needs to be maximized in order to get anywhere in encounters. In Resident Evil 4, all the enemies you encounter are bullet sponges and take way too many shots to put down. However, while their bodies are resilient, they are susceptible to being shot in the head and legs, with which, if the enemy either staggers back or ends up on one knee, you can run up on them and receive a context-sensitive action which will result in the enemy being thrown to the floor, at which point you can take out your knife and begin slashing at their ankles because the knife is the only weapon you have without an ammo count. This is just a general idea on how to conserve ammo, as when you progress through the game, you'll obtain different weapons, all of which have their own unique capabilities that allow you to conserve ammo in different ways, like the aforementioned shotgun having the ability to one-shot enemies if you aim high enough to hit their heads. I really like the ammo maximization aspect of Resident Evil 4, as it provides an element of strategy to every encounter that can change at the drop of a hat, based on the enemy's proximity to you and how much ammo you have left. It also asks the player to be flexible with their weapon choices. Because of the limited ammo, you won't always have your preferred gun for every situation, so finding each gun's strengths, weaknesses, and optimal ranges is pivotal to conserve ammo. I found this one out the hard way early on in my run during the waterfall section, where I was using headshots from the shotgun too often and found myself with little to no ammo left in it as enemies surrounded me from the front and to the side. In my head, I knew that this was a section designed for a shotgun, and only having 9mm and rifle shots probably wasn't going to cut it. So I used my remaining shotgun bullets to clear a path through the group that came from the waterfall, and like any hero would, I ran with my tail between my legs. It's not the coolest story I can tell about my experiences playing Resident Evil 4, but it is a fun one that I had with it, as it also brings up a thing that I really like about Resident Evil 4 being the ability to run away. Now, this isn't something special to Resident Evil 4, as, well, any old game with stage transitions has this ability, but combined with the fact that Resident Evil 4 is still a horror game containing scares, all of which managed to frighten me, I thought escaping from a room filled with enemies lended well with the whole survival horror part of the game the series is known for. Running away also gives a bit more weight to situations where you're forced to stay and fight, as there is no easy way out and you have to get through this. And now that I think about it, in those moments where the game wants you to tough it out, I did have some pretty good fun as well. And for that, I really have to give it up for how guns feel when you use them and how enemies react when hit with them. I rarely if ever play shooters, so the concept of getting excited for kickback is a new one for me. But boy howdy are there some guns that honestly, I can't describe other than perfect. Seeing enemies fly back when bullets hit them, alongside Leon's recovery animation when you broke out one of the stronger guns, gives me such an odd feeling of satisfaction that I just can't get anywhere else. My favorite of all the guns when it comes to recovery animation are the Broken Butterfly / Killer 7, which fittingly enough are the most powerful guns you can receive ammo drops for and give Leon the most recovery per use. This should be viewed as a bad thing, but honestly, I love it. The enormous kickback makes me believe that whatever's in these bullets hurt like hell, and the sound effect that accompanies each shot providing such a satisfying crunch that I honestly can't imagine the game without it. It should be noted that Leon's guns can also interact with enemy projectiles mid-flight, having the ability to not only stop their momentum, but in some cases turn their attacks against them, adding in that optional skill potential that Capcom games are known for, and making the player feel so cool for doing it all on their own. However, even though the gameplay is good, I do have a few complaints. The biggest one being, in a game where you're supposed to be constantly switching between different guns for different situations, why is there no quick switch button between the weapons? It just feels super cumbersome to constantly pause the game in order to switch weapons, especially so when one of the face buttons is literally doing nothing but existing. Also, while I'm at it, why can you combine herbs and such in the pause menu, but not ammo with guns? Maybe the reload animation is supposed to be some kind of punishment, but I don't know, it just feels inconsistent with how the rest of the game operates. In addition, why can't I use the left analog stick to aim my gun? It's not like I can move and shoot at the same time, so why disable it in the first place? This is especially bizarre since I can use the D-pad to aim, which also controls how Leon moves outside of aiming. And finally, I wish there was a dodge button in this game. While dodging prompts exist, the game usually reserves them for boss fights. Regular encounters don't have this at all, and due to the way that Leon controls, being that you need to turn, then run, I wind up in a lot of situations where I see the startup of an enemy's attack, and I go, I guess I got hit, because there's nothing I can do about it unless I was already in motion. On the topic of enemies, as you continue on playing, you'll encounter more than just your run-of-the-mill villagers, as you'll eventually bump shoulders with the more devoted members of Sadler's cult who have adult versions of the Plagas in their body, which allow the villagers to act a little different. The most notable difference being when you headshot them, they're not dead, as a bug will come out to continue on the fight. Now, in addition to whether or not a bug pops out being a randomized chance, there are 3 types of bugs that can pop out from a severed head. One giving increased attack range, one that when the body dies will detach from its host in order to attack you, and one that has the ability to attack the frame rate. It should also be noted that your rifle too has the ability to attack the frame rate, specifically when you're reloading ammo into it. I have no idea why, since it doesn't seem to be too taxing on the game, but I digress. Eliminating adult Plagas is no different from a normal enemy, as you still have to aim for their head to kill them, or use flash grenades, which for some reason kills them in one shot. While pretty easy to manage all things considered, by god are these things gross to look at, and I can't stand having these things in close proximity to me, to the point where if one is near me, I will waste all my flash grenades I have on my person without hesitation. And unfortunately for me, this is where the horror aspect of the game really springs to light, as more and more grotesque enemies emerge the further you get into the game, and boy did I not handle that well. Every time I got introduced to a new enemy type, I would get so freaked out that I needed to pause the game for an odd number of minutes to calm myself down. But it didn't end there, as after it was introduced, I would dread encountering it again, which in my attempt to try and prevent myself from being scared, I tried to expect them in any new area, which then caused me to get multiple headaches because I couldn't stop thinking about anything related to the game, which then caused me to take more breaks. When it was all said and done, my total playtime was 21 plus hours, when the median time for completion was 16 hours. Even though that's not so bad for a first time through, that still means that almost 6 hours were dedicated to my self-inflicted mental damage. And I just don't know how to take that. I mean, on the one hand, this was my first action-filled horror game, but at the same time, I just can't help but look back at the footage I recorded and think to myself, I struggled with my own thoughts for no reason, and now I look like an idiot for trying to be too cautious. Hell, remember when I told you this game has a run button? Well, I rarely if ever used it because I was so scared of what could possibly jump out at me when I dropped my guard. But here's the thing, Resident Evil 4 rarely relied on jump scares, and when it did, it was particularly action focused. The only time walking was ever beneficial to me was in the prison area with the camouflaged enemies. Fun fact, I was actually thinking on streaming this game for Halloween, but decided against it to make this video, and I'm glad I did, because this would be the most infuriating playthrough to watch, and I should know I had to edit this. Get a move on, asshole! And you want to know what's the funniest part about all of this? Is that after dealing with each enemy, I'd always have a brief moment where I'd stop and think to myself, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. Every time, without fail. For some reason, I just couldn't overcome my mind when playing the game and fell victim to my own thoughts the whole way through. It definitely felt like I fought myself more than I fought any enemy in this game. This also held true for bosses, which, yeah, look pretty disgusting, but in the end, they weren't anything mind-blowingly horrific, with the exception being the second boss in the game, the big guy from before, and that's because he's the poster boy for body horror, and his second face makes me want to cough up my lunch. On the topic of bosses, they were indeed a thing, most of them being a case of shoot them until they die, and others being a case of shoot the specific part of them to open up their weakness, and then shoot them until they die. The only two bosses that really stand out from the crowd are the right hand boss fight because it's the only boss in the game where you can run from it, and the Krauser boss fight, not only because it's a multi-layer boss starting out as a obstacle course in which Krauser tries to stop you from collecting 3 tablet pieces, popping up at certain intervals to impede your progress, and the second part is a proper fight on top of a tower, with the tower being lined in bombs getting ready to detonate. I really like the Krauser fight in particular because it's definitely one of the more different boss fights in the game, as well as unintentionally being the most entertaining one as well. As I quickly found out, Krauser is nearsighted and couldn't hit water if he fell out of a boat. I was not expecting a comedy show with my boss fight, but this was a nice change of pace. Now, apparently, Resident Evil 4 has an adaptive difficulty system built into it, which, every time you die, the game tries to subtly fix itself to your skill level, which, for the most part, I can definitely say throughout my playthrough I did not notice it. But if what's happening on screen is the result of said adaptive difficulty, I can say that, at least in this instance, it's a little too obvious. I would talk about the other bosses, except sometime after the halfway point I bought a rocket launcher and used it on a boss and found out it was a boss killer, and then I found out that you could buy it again. It was kind of a pain as it took up some space which limited the amount of ammo I can take with me, but it more than made up for it for how quickly it dealt with bosses. The exception being Krauser because he straight up does not care. No lie, I laughed my ass off when this happened. Krauser was just the gift that kept on giving. I do have a bit more to say about Krauser, but in order to do that, we need to go on ahead and finish off the story. So with that being said, let's dive back in. So, after avoiding villagers for 2 hours, Leon and Ash make their way into a castle, where they find the lord of said castle to be a small man dressed like Napoleon Bonaparte named Ramon Salazar, another one of Sadler's puppets. The fact that he's dressed like Napoleon and that he works for Sadler is the extent of his character, as he exists to explain where the Plagas come from, in which they were an ancient creature that was sealed by his family and never supposed to be released, but Salad Face managed to sweet talk him into joining his cult, which eventually led him to undo the seal. The castle is when the game reaches max for its creepiness vibes, as the atmosphere and the sound design make me feel uncomfortable and dread whatever's coming next. The sound design in particular being the thing that creeped me out the most, having little touches like enemies chanting in the background and the sounds of bugs wing flapping, which helped clue you in that you weren't alone in the room. It also made this game impossible to listen with headphones on, as hearing wing flaps directly in my ear made me so uncomfortable that I had to rely on my monitor speakers to continue on playing. The castle is also where the game ranks up in terms of ridiculous action, as cult members with rocket launchers start appearing, and some of them even manning turrets to take out Leon. Unfortunately, this is also the point in the game where I realized that, just like Salazar, the other characters are paper thin, as none of them have any arcs to go through or have any twists and turns to experience. The only exception to this is Luis, surprisingly enough, who actually started out as a researcher for Sadler, who was too interested in studying the Plagas to see the evil that Sadler had planned for it. And so he defected, which is why he was tied up earlier in the story. Although, interestingly, it said that Los Illuminados was looking for him the whole time, so that begs the question, who tied him up? Well, anyways, Luis wants to do good and make up for his childlike fascination with the Plagas, and it's why, despite not being infected with the Plagas, he risks his neck out for Leon and Ash. However, you don't find any of this out until after he dies in optional memos. Thankfully, the game is linear, so you can't miss him, but it definitely doesn't do him justice, especially when Leon does the whole "I'll make him pay" line, which doesn't feel earned considering that he's only spent a collective 20 minutes getting to know Luis. But what do I know? I only spent a collective 20 hours getting to know Leon. And with that being said, for a character who plays it as straight as he can, I can't help but find Leon to be a fun protagonist to follow. If I could describe Leon in one word, it would be the action hero. He always has a clever one-liner to drop, he always does the super cool over the top thing that makes me grin ear to ear, and he has tons of ladies around him with which he has no sexual relations with. He may not be the most complex character in the game, but he's damn fun to watch, and getting to see him interact with this crazy world was a genuine reason why I wanted to continue on playing, even when fear had completely overtaken my mind. Speaking of fear, I noticed something really interesting about my thoughts whenever I saw a new enemy type and got afraid of it. I'd think to myself, I don't want to see Leon die. Never in my life did I think like this for a video game protagonist, but Leon managed to be the exception to that rule. The reason Leon was so special was because I feared seeing his death animation. animation. As I figured, if the developers went out of the way to program bullets to snipe sides out of midair, they'd totally put in the work for highly specific death animations. And unfortunately, I was right. I only died gruesomely once in my entire playthrough of Resident Evil 4, and ironically enough, it didn't bother me as bad as I thought it would. Probably because I spent like 20 hours racing for it, but regardless, it was pretty interesting to see that Resident Evil 4 got me to genuinely care about its protagonist in a way where most other video games wish they could pull off. I guess it is true what they say about life and death experiences bringing you closer to one another, even if that person is fictional and the danger is in your mind. Other than that, I can't really say all that much about the other characters. Ash is the damsel in distress, Sadler is the villain, Salazar is the lackey, and the mysterious second intruder introduced in the castle section named Ada is the cool woman that is mysterious and knows Leon by name. Huh. You know, when I say it all like that, this plot sounds way too similar to that of an action movie. It has a hero that's more than capable of dealing with a larger-than-life problem, a best friend character that has a lot more going on than they initially let on, and side characters that don't really add much of anything to the story. Thankfully, the game isn't too long for this to really become a problem, and even with its action movie structure, the game does a good job of balancing both action and horror to provide an interesting blend of dreadful excitement. That is, until the game decides to stop doing that, but more on that in a second. So after traversing through the castle, in which Ash gets captured for like the 9th time in a row and sent to an island where the Plagas can transform into an adult in peace, Leon is forced to travel over after dealing with Salazar and his men. The island section of Resident Evil 4 is when things go off the rails, as the game introduces new enemy types like army men wielding Gatling guns, army troops who for some reason don't have a gun, Fist of the North Star cosplayers, and has a scene where a helicopter blows up the terrain like it's Rambo as Leon fights 3 dudes manning turrets. Now, don't misunderstand, there are scares in this section, and honestly just thinking about them causes me to shiver. However, I'd say overall, this section of the game is more in line with my taste, which you'd think would be a good thing, but it's complicated. My main issue with this section is purely aesthetic based. I mean, yeah, it makes sense that Sadler has a small army considering how he was talking about proving himself to be a power that can rival America, but for a good chunk of the game, the enemies have been villagers and dudes in robes, which makes sense given the whole cult thing he's running. Now that we shifted the design to something a little more honest with the game's action-packed self, it feels like something's missing from the earlier segments, which I'm surprised I missed at all considering how much terror it caused me. It doesn't help that on the island, we finally find out why Sadler had to make a cult in the first place, thanks to a memo he left behind for himself, I guess, where he explains that the Plagas still retain the host consciousness, which is how Luis was able to portray him earlier. Not saying that militia can't be religious, but I don't know, there's just something about these designs that clash with the atmosphere Resident Evil 4 had built early on, as the game went out of its way to show how Sadler warped the mind of countless villagers to worship him like a god. If the church bell rang, the villagers dropped everything to hear his word. If they weren't around Sadler, then the more devoted members would chant like crazy, even keeping up their chants when they attack Leon and Ash. The army men don't do anything or have a cutscene to show how badly Sadler brainwashed them. While yes, they do have Plagas in them, there isn't anything more than that, making them feel pretty generic, at least in my opinion. Still, as I mentioned, this was my jam, so despite not thinking it fit together, I was entertained nonetheless. The island is also where you finally meet Krauser, and I have no idea who this guy is. I mean, yes, something like this was bound to happen jumping in this deep, but like, I went on the wiki page to confirm if he appeared in any Resident Evil game prior to this, and it says that 4 was his first game. I'm sorry, but what? This guy talks like he has history with Leon, and this is his first game? Is Krauser like a novel character or something? He seems to have quite a write-up on his wiki page, so I assume that he's a character that wasn't dropped after this game, but you know what? It really doesn't matter. Krauser's conversations with Leon are ultimately meaningless, at least in the perspective of a newbie, so you can literally turn off the audio and you lose nothing. Anyways, it doesn't take long for Leon to deal with Sadler's small army and rescue Ash, the both of them finding a lab deep in the island which conveniently removes the Plagas from their bodies. However, the two didn't manage this alone, as along the way Ada has been helping Leon from the shadows. Unfortunately, in order to help Leon rescue Ash, she stepped too far into the light, causing Sadler to kidnap her too. After arriving on the final boss platform, Leon literally saves Ada in seconds and deals with Sadler equally as fast by delivering a rocket into his disgusting face. But Leon can't celebrate just yet, as Ada then betrays him to nab the sample Sadler had on his person. Why? Well, as explained a little earlier in the story, Ada was planning to obtain the sample of the Plagas and betray Krauser and by extension Wesker by giving it to the mysterious organization that hired her. Who is that organization? Never stated, at least in the main game, so as far as I'm concerned, it's herself with a mustache. And once it's secured, she arms the bomb she had planted all over the island. Ada isn't heartless though, as he gives Leon jet ski keys so he and Ash can escape the island from blowing up. After riding the waves to freedom, Leon then friend-zones Ash after she tried to get him to sleep with her, ending the game.
After you take me back to my place, how about we do some, overtime?
No thanks, bro.
Although, it should be noted that right before the final boss, there is a memo left by Sadler detailing a plan B if all else fails, which I believe is handled in a separate game mode called Left Behind, where you take control of Ada to stop this plan. But I didn't record any footage of that for this video cause honestly, I was a little tired and didn't have it in me to deal with any more scares. And the end credits is actually really cool, as you're shown slideshows of Sadler slowly converting the once peaceful villagers to his puppets, which just makes me feel bad for these guys knowing what fate had in store for them. Also, the ending has Leon attempt to hit on one of his teammates and get friend zoned, so I thought that was funny. That being said, Resident Evil 4 was a fantastic time. While I didn't take well to the scares, I can't deny that I still had a good time with this game despite that. It's a good ass arcadey shooter that may have a weak as hell plot, but more than makes up for it with its gameplay and absurdly cool action scenes that honestly need to be seen with your own eyes to believe. I can definitely see myself playing this game in the far future, but as for the rest of the series, I don't think I'll be touching them anytime soon, unless I'm closely following along a guide the first time through, and since that kind of defeats the point, especially in the case of the ones that are trying to have a more horrific atmosphere, I think I'll just put them on the shelf for now. I can and will recommend this game to those who aren't a fan of horror, because as much horror as it has just as much action cheese to help offset that, and at least to me anyways, that balance was a key point to my enjoyment of this game. And if any of you are interested, you're in luck because Resident Evil 4 is ported to everything but your goddamn toaster. Jokes aside, seriously, this game is everywhere. If you own a console from the years 2002 to 2019, chances are you can play this game without any issue. And to boot, the game is pretty damn cheap even without sales, so you can get it whenever you want, whenever you feel like.